some examples of the kinds of questions that we use in the interviews. There's no guarantee that you'll be asked these specific questions, of course, but these just indicate the different types of questions that we use across a range of different subjects, both on the science side, on the arts and humanities side, and also in between. So the first slide here is obviously a maths example. And this is just a good way of indicating how, during the interviews, the interviewers will often start with something that the person being interviewed should be able to do relatively easily. So here it's basically a calculus question, and the first question here, most people who are studying maths or further maths should be able to handle without any problems. But then the second question is something that the majority of people who are applying won't have considered before. So rather than just asking someone to, in this case, it has to do with calculating derivatives. So rather than asking someone to calculate, say, the first derivative or the second derivative or the third derivative, they're being asked to calculate the nth derivative. And they may never have been asked to do that previously. But that's okay. If they think about this problem in a sort of careful way, and if they think very analytically, they may well decide, okay, I'll calculate the first derivative, or the second, or the third, the fourth, and then they'll start to look for patterns to see whether that helps them get closer to a solution for the second question here. So that's just a concrete example of how the questions will push the people being interviewed beyond what they know already towards things that they haven't really considered, perhaps. The second example is for a different subject, but still on the science side. So this is the sort of question that you might get in an interview for, say, medicine or possibly for natural sciences. So this is an example of how the questions might be sort of staged so that they get progressively more detailed. So in this case, it starts out with a relatively sort of high-level question about potassium. And this may be something that the person being interviewed knows, or maybe they don't know. That doesn't really matter. The interviewers can help if the person hasn't really thought about this before. But then it can gradually lead into a much more detailed discussion about this topic. And every time the interviewee is given a little bit of additional information, the interviewers will be keen to see how they make use of that and how that informs the conclusions that they reach at each stage of this sort of discussion as the discussion gets deeper into the topic. So that again is a very sort of standard pattern of questioning that we use in interviews for a wide range of subjects. This third example is just one instance of how we might use some sort of prompt material, some sort of graph or plot, some sort of visual information as part of the interviews. So here, as you can see, this is really a graph that indicates life expectancy and how that changes in different parts of the world over time. And the interviewers in this case might simply share this plot with the interviewee, and then simply ask a question like, what sort of conclusions might you be inclined to reach given this information? Now, obviously, there's no single right answer to that, but there are a range of things that the person being interviewed might notice, might be interested in. They might be interested, for instance, in how these patterns differ for different parts of the world. They might start thinking about this historically, trying to understand why most of the lines on this graph start going up at a certain point. What's causing that? What has changed historically or culturally to cause those patterns to start to change at that point? So there are a wide range of things that a person being interviewed might choose to point to, and they all provide a really interesting starting point for a more detailed discussion of an interesting topic like this. So that's just an example of how prompt material might be used for a range of different subjects. The next example is more on the sort of arts and humanities side. So this is, say, for a subject like English. Someone might be given a text. Here it's obviously a poem, and they might be asked to analyse this poem, to sort of go through it quite carefully, sort of pretty much word by word or certainly line by line, explaining how they're interpreting this text, how they're constructing a sort of meaningful interpretation of it as they go through. And again, the interviewers might be interested in seeing how the interviewees cope when they encounter a word or phrase that they might not have encountered before. Can they make sense of it in context? How much help do they need in order to do that? So here in the second stanza, there's the phrase stirrup cup. That's likely to be a phrase that very few people have heard or used. But can they work out from the context what that means in a text of this kind? That's the sort of thing that the interviewers will be interested in determining. And then these examples are just two instances of how sentences that have appeared in the personal statement might trigger questions in a given interview. So here you've got examples from history and from philosophy. And they're similar in that the sentences in the personal statements were just not particularly specific. And so the questions that the interviewers asked are simply trying to obtain more information about what the applicant had in mind when they wrote those sentences in the personal statement. So this is really just probing their understanding of the topic that they themselves chose to mention in the personal statement. So particularly for subjects on the arts and humanities side, that's a very sort of usual type of questioning that forms part of